Welcome to the Myth and Magic Authors Podcast, folklore and fantasy topics aimed at creative storytellers. To write stories and challenge your brain with exciting ideas, delve into these presentations and reflections. See how fantasy realms are based on actual world history, legend, and lore. Study fairy tales, nature fables, and supernaturalism to engage in a jumble of concepts that will trigger your fancy and get you writing imaginatively. Now, here's your host, Neil Mack.
Hello, fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, the podcast especially for authors of fantasy fiction. So today I want to talk about authors being modern-day seers. I want to ask, is a fantasy author a modern-day soothsayer? And I want to explore the figure of Cassandra. On Myth and Magic episode 34, which was a show that aired on the 13th of May 2020, I discussed the natural and the supernatural abilities that some authors seem to possess and how we might mysteriously be able to predict the future in our works of fiction. And in that show I considered how the suspense writer Dean Koontz could have predicted the coronavirus outbreak long before the world ever knew anything about it. The Eye of Darkness, which was his book that he wrote as Lee Nichols, and that came out in 1981, surprisingly claims that the deadly microorganisms that threaten the world had been created inside a research facility outside the city of Wuhan. And Koontz renamed the bioweapon that he talks about in his book the Wuhan 400, and that was in 2008. And that Wuhan connection was made in all the editions from 2008 onwards. I wanted to go back to that topic because new research carried out in Germany has, in all seriousness, pondered the possibility that fiction writers really can predict the future, either consciously or unconsciously. And it makes the claim that their predictions could be harvestable, or at least interpretable, to measure and assess imminent and invisible threats. So it's exciting stuff, and I certainly think it fits in with the Myth and Magic bill, because it prompts us to reflect on the idea of channeling, whether it's paranormal or whether it's not paranormal. So I'll get into the work that they're doing in Germany in a moment. And it's a project, by the way, known as Cassandra. But first, let's turn our attention to some of the oldest storytellers in the old Irish tradition. And these were known as the filí, who were amongst the first storytellers of the British Islands. And they were cherished and nurtured by kings and by leaders and by politicians because they seemed to have an uncanny ability to predict the future and the future events, sometimes with disconcerting accuracy. F-I-L-I. Well, according to the textbook of Irish literature, which is by the respected old Irish scholar Eleanor Hull, the filí, who were part of a philosophical branch of the Druidic culture, they were primarily poets and storytellers who were also famous as magicians and legislators and judges and counsellors to the chieftains. And they were the society's most important information givers. Their most impressive ability, however, was the power to predict or anticipate at least what might happen next. And this meant that society celebrated and esteemed the filí. And they were highly valued by warlords and kings and princelings. They often employed the art of kenning, and that is using figurative language, for example, euphemistic expression or equivocation or innuendo, to tackle challenging subjects in a subtle and entertaining way, which meant that many of their predictions were memorable and, of course, they were enlightening. Their importance in society was not so much that they shared and perpetuated the ancient traditions, in other words, the folklore, the myths and the legends of their peoples, because that type of storytelling was usually done by a bard or a minstrel, but they effectively and accurately foretold the future. But how did they do this? Was it by supernatural means? Well, I suggest it's because they were natural and talented storytellers in their own right. So they were used to constantly having to use their imaginations to come up with new, entertaining and enlightening ways to convey messages to their audience. And as brave innovators, they were often visionaries too. And through their free thinking and through the use of unbridled power of imagination, they often envisioned the unimaginable. They might think of the warrior king who could be defeated by a commoner, or a disease that could wipe out an entire population, or a flood that could devastate a city. It was because of these daring tales of imagination, but also of prophecy, that the folks took to the filí as if they were clairvoyants. Although it's important to emphasise that they did not use any magic or divination or any other supernatural means to predict, sometimes quite accurately, the events to come. They only used their acuity, their wisdom and their insight, along with those great imaginations, to gain a better understanding of any possible future. They were talented enough, of course, to explain what they predicted in a riveting way, and this is why the filí were assumed to be second-sighted. And are we, the fantasy authors of the 21st century, the new generation of filí? Like us, the filí of yore, and also the bards and minstrels in old Irish times, employed various creative storytelling techniques to dispense their wisdom. One such creative technique was known as kenning. And by the way, at this stage I ought to remind you that the history, mythology, folklore and cultural material of these ancient peoples, like most ancient peoples, was received and preserved and transmitted orally. They called it the oral tradition. And therefore, the oldest stories always relied on devices that made those stories easier to remember, because these people wrote nothing down. But by using fancy techniques such as kenning, the filí got their stories remembered. An excellent example of oral tradition that will be familiar to you is the Law of the Jungle, which was recited by the wolf cubs in Kipling's The Jungle Book, and it was learned and repeated by Mowgli. Clearly, wolves cannot read and they don't have any books. So how do they pass on their proverbs and their rules and their history to their descendants? Well, they share the most important words, the most important stories with each other by regularly repeating those stories. So, using kennings. Kenning is the root of our words like canny, and it also is the root of ken, which means to know, and canny means shrewd. Incidentally, uncanny, which we use quite a lot, literally means beyond the scope of any knowledge, which is why it's meant to be taken as supernatural. But what actually is kenning, and can you use it? You can. If you want to write your own kenning, and by the way, I feel you ought to try, you will need to create say words that have two parts. The first part is a base word, also known as the head word or keyword. Then you have to write a determinant, and this is a factor that affects the base word. Although when complete, a kenning does not have to be in exactly that order, it can be swapped the other way around. But to give you an idea, a sea channel that's used for navigation might be known as a sailing path or a swan road. Do you see? Wine can be described as grape blood. A bright star in the sky used for navigation could be a sky candle. An obsequious person might be known as a brown noser. An office worker might be known as a pencil pusher. And something that nobody wants at all is often known as a hot potato. All your readers will hopefully be bookworms. So invent your own kennings and use them. But let's talk about Project Cassandra. If everything I've said so far sounds somewhat airy-fairy and perhaps pie in the sky, I want to bring home some news about a real-world effort that's taken advantage of this extraordinary ability of storytellers to be able to forecast events. The Early Crisis Detection Through Literature Evaluation project, that's headed up by Professor Dr. Jürgen Wertheimer, has been working since 2017 on making literary texts usable as prognosis instruments for violence prevention. The Cassandra project, as it's become known, results from cooperation between the German Ministry of Defence and the Global Ethics Institute for Early Crisis Detection and Violence Prevention. The Cassandra project analyses the literature from crisis-prone regions, in other words, those that present geopolitical challenges to Germany and her allies, and then opens up questions related to practice. In 2019, the Cassandra project focused on Nigeria, for example, the Maghreb Algerian areas, and also Kosovo, as well as Georgia and Armenia. The Cassandra project analyses the text produced by writers of speculative fiction in these troubled regions, paying specific attention to those who have been persecuted or excluded by the regimes or who have suffered repression because of their writing. Because it's hypothesised that those writers who get close to the truth about what's going on in their own society are often the first people to be excluded by that society and certainly to be scorned, slighted and resented. Analysts from the Cassandra project evaluate the fiction that's been written by these people, and often it's material that's been written by former journalists who've discovered that using literary devices such as satire and symbolism and allegory within a novel is safer than writing it into a newspaper report. But they look at these type of stories, and then the Cassandra project believes that useful information can be obtained which will support a probabilistic estimate of future events. What all this means is that from reading fiction and from analysing it, the Cassandra project team can build a mood picture, which is also referred to as an emotion map, of the region that they're focused on, and that will identify potentials for violence at an early stage and assess the changing dynamics of the situation. Professor Wertheimer believes that the disposition of a culture or society to violence can be predicted by reading the fiction writings of such marginalised artists. Some have described the idea as like using a literary seismograph. It means hard data can be gleaned from atmospheric cues found within a region's popular literature, and politicians and diplomats and even the military can use these fact-tuned cues when considering how to address emerging issues in crisis regions. Trying to turn humanities into an academic science is of course not easy, and there have been many sceptics and cynics along the way. But Wertheimer and his team have had documented successes in places like Afghanistan, Algeria, Azerbaijan and Bosnia. The instincts of its researchers proved to be reliable in 2019 when the Cassandra project accurately predicted the demonstrations and protests, the so-called Revolution of Smiles, that would eventually lead to the resignation of President Bouteflika, who had been the longest-serving head of state in Algeria. I think the key to understanding when any of this is actually really worthwhile is to decipher the prognosis of the fictioneers before their prophesied instant and not afterwards. And of course this is where things become complicated and inconvenient for politicians. For example, if we took seriously the predictions of Dean Koontz in his Eye of Darkness, wouldn't world governments have done something about it? And the simple answer is probably not. Author Stanley Johnson, who's British Prime Minister's own father, is Boris Johnson's own father, wrote a pocket thriller about a virus in 1982, and his book contains staggering parallels to the COVID-19 pandemic. But did his own son do anything about this prophesied and fictional sequence of events? No. In fact, almost one of the first things that Prime Minister Boris Johnson did when he came to power was scrap the Government Threats, Hazards, Resilience and Contingency Committee, the THRCC, which was a group that had been specifically set up to address the threat of major disease outbreaks before they happen. It's almost as if our leaders prefer not to know the future. Due to his decision to scrap the THRCC, a parliamentary report has been published and it said, and I quote, "The United Kingdom was one of the worst performing states in the first 8 months of the pandemic and in early October. There were worrying signs that the UK was still ill prepared for a second surge during early autumn. And yet the United Kingdom knew in advance about COVID because the Prime Minister's own father had written exactly what would happen in 1982. Ill prepared, by the way, that's what the parliamentary report said, ill prepared. People, and especially decision makers, but I think all people, don't like forecasts. They don't like predictions. And they particularly don't like forecasts and predictions when they're bang on target. They prefer to be ill prepared, like the parliamentary report says. And that's because it gives them more wiggle room. And that brings us, of course, quite neatly to Cassandra. Who was Cassandra? Why did she have a complex? And why is the project named after her? Well, Cassandra was a Trojan priestess in Greek mythology, and she was cursed to utter accurate prophecies, although they were never to be believed. She's the daughter of King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy. Her older brother was the hero Hector, who's played by Eric Bana in the film, if you went to see it. And she had the gift of being able to see into the future with uncanny accuracy. Now, you would have expected that this was a desirable gift, and she might have been able to use it profitably to save her people from things like disease and drought and war and natural hazards. But things did not turn out that way. Tragically for her and for Greece, Apollo, the god, arranged it so that they always disbelieved her predictions, despite the veracity of her words. People began to think of her as a madwoman and a liar, and the authorities even locked her up in a pyramid to protect their people from the harmful predictions that she muttered, although, of course, the king made sure her prophetic utterances were written down and sent to him. Cassandra foresaw the destruction of Troy, and it happened. She also foresaw that her cousin Aeneas would escape the fall of Troy and found a new nation in Rome, and that was also true. And the Romans, of course, would make all Greeks slaves. She even tried to warn people about the possibility of Greek warriors hiding inside the Trojan horse, and those warnings were also dismissed. In fact, they put many of her predictions down to just women's problems or mental health issues. Have we ever heard that excuse before? Frankly, the ancient world, and the modern world too, while we're about it, is not ready for prophets and oracles. There's a widespread refusal to believe predictions and forecasts, even though we as a society and our leaders know those predictions and forecasts to be true. There's a universal tendency towards denial, because I think denial is a powerful defence against self-criticism, anxiety and guilt. So, counterintuitively, and perhaps even preposterously, the powers that be ignored the uncomfortable and the disturbing truths that were expounded by Cassandra, and later were expounded by the likes of Stanley Johnson and Dean Koontz, perhaps because they prefer the possibilities and the leeway that hindsight presents to them. Unsurprisingly, I think you can guess what I'm going to say, but unsurprisingly and somewhat predictably, the German project Cassandra had its funding withdrawn from it in the winter of 2020. But let's leave this thought about prophecy and about fantasy fiction authors being able to predict the future on a high note, and I want to leave you with a quote from Professor Dr. Wertheimer, who told Philip Alterman of the Guardian Weekend magazine, week before last, "Literature is at the centre of my life because I believe it can be a springboard into the real world." What is storytelling? Let me tell you a secret. My wife, she can't tell a funny story. It's not that she doesn't try, you understand, but she gets bogged down in all the details. For example, was it 3 men or 4 who walked into a pub? Was one man Scottish, or was he only raised in Scotland but born elsewhere? And did they actually go to a pub, or was it a bar or a club? And why were there only 3? And how did they meet anyway? And of course then there's the punchline. Most of the time my wife forgets the punchline completely. But on the rare occasions that she does manage to remember it, she tells the words in exactly the same tone that she used before all of the sad intricacies of the joke. So the listeners often lose the punchline. Not that it matters though, because by then most listeners have lost interest in the whole story and they are no longer actively listening. In fact, they're checking their phones and they're thinking about what they'll make for dinner. "You can't tell a story," that's what I tell my wife. And she says, right back, "But oh yeah, you can, can't you?" And we all know what she means by that, don't we? She means, I'm a liar. Because that's what telling stories means for our culture. For our society, in the 21st century, telling stories means telling lies. No wonder people distrust journalists. You may already know this, but my other job when I'm not writing fiction is as a journalist. And I admit I'm not a very good one, I'm a very lightweight one. And even my press pass says entertainment, so you can tell from that I'm insignificant and I make a marginal difference in the world of journalism. But yeah, I work writing stories for magazines. My stories are sometimes published in newspapers, and of course those papers will become gyp wrappers probably the next day. Sometimes people believe my stories, but most often they don't. But that's fine, because as long as they're entertained by them, that's all that matters. I once went to one of those medieval fairs that they organised in historical places, like castles or National Trust gardens. The one I went to was in a royal park, and I very much enjoyed the spit roast, and I really enjoyed the mead that was served to me by plump wenches, and I enjoyed watching those folk dances. And in a corner of a barn I found a large man with luscious rosy cheeks and a long raggedy beard, and he sat on a pile of hay in front of a smoking fire. But he didn't look like he was doing anything. He wasn't making anything, he wasn't fabricating anything, he wasn't dancing. So I said to the man, "What do you do?" "I'm a storyteller," he told me with a gummy smile. He ran his stained fingers through his beard. "Storytelling is the oldest of all professions," he declared with some confidence. And I looked at this guy and I thought, well, someone had to find those sticks to make the fire, right? Someone had to produce the hay that you're sitting on. Someone had to spin the thread that made all those clothes that cover all of your limbs. And I guess an entire army of planters and growers and gardeners had to work all year very hard to fill that big belly of yours. But I didn't say any of these things. I just smiled and I allowed him to tell me a story. And I'll tell you this, his story was so good that I forgot all about his claim to be a representative of the oldest of all professions. But I started to think about him again this week because I came across a definition of storytelling that I want to give you that makes sense of my wife's desperate inability to tell a joke, while at the same time acknowledging the fat medieval man's claim that storytelling is the oldest profession. And this is the definition. Are you ready? Storytelling is the urge to organise the boring randomness of life and all its mundanity, and to spin it, to take away the uncertainty and the abstractness, and retell it to make things more entertaining. I like this definition. It admits that life is dull. It admits that life throws up randomness. And it admits that life is filled with unexpected detail. But a good story doesn't need to have all the randomness and the detail and the dullness. A good storyteller discards those things. A good storyteller discards the randomness and the monotony and instead adds conflict and resolution and a beginning and an end. A storyteller makes a good story of it. And are storytellers liars? Not really. Storytellers are not telling the whole truth, I'll grant you that, because the whole truth is filled with boring bits and details and randomness. So they select a truth. They tell a selected truth. They select the best bits of truth and they tell those. And for a professional storyteller like you must remember to get rid of the boring bits and the detail and the randomness and keep it punchy, and then that way it entertains. And next week I'm talking to Ra Ariel, who's a Generation Z poet and an author. If you've not heard from a young, new and emerging poet before, here's an opportunity to learn more about a young person's perspective and see literature and poetry from a young person's angle. Ra published her first book today. I'm speaking on the 7th of July, at just 17 years old. And of course, this early success has given her a unique perspective on the writing and publishing world. She says she can help other aspiring poets and writers improve and expand their work and to achieve their goals. The debut poetry collection, which is called Encapsulated Emotions, weaves a compelling story composed of layers of truth and emotion. And she's also on the staff of a literary magazine titled Juvenalia, whose stated mission is to create a voice for young artists while highlighting global issues. So I'll talk to her about global issues, I'll talk to her about poetry, and I'll talk to her about what it's like to be a Generation Z poet and author in the 21st century. So tune in next week for my podcast interview with Ra Arayal.